I'm with the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases, and the EveryLife Foundation is a coalition of patient organizations and other stakeholders, including industry and academics, and we focus on policy solutions. We do not develop registries. And many of you, who I recognize a lot of colleagues and friends who are here today, are members of our coalition and are part of our community congress and help us form the policies that we work on. But I have in my career spent more than 2 decades working on registries through a number of different lenses. And Harsha asked me to spend some time today reflecting on that and some of the work that a lot of our colleagues in this space are doing. So a little bit about who we are and then what I'll be reflecting on today. So for those who may not know, the EveryLife Foundation, as I said, is a coalition organization. We focus on 4 pillars. We focus on accelerating therapeutic development in the rare disease space, access to those therapies, and reducing the diagnostic odyssey through improved technology and newborn screening. And as I said, we focus on policy. And we do it by identifying the spaces and places where patient experience and the patient voice should be present, making room at that table, and bringing patient communities to the table. We don't speak for patients. So I think that's really important. So the next slide. So in my career, I have spent, as Harsha said, several, almost 2 decades with the Muscular Dystrophy Association, the neuromuscular space. I started in the clinical space at that time, and then I had some time as the national director of the ALS division, where I had time working on the national surveillance program for ALS with the CDC, as well as the national surveillance program for the muscular dystrophies. And we spent a lot of time today talking about registries. We haven't talked as much about surveillance, but that's a really important type of data that can inform decision-making. And there are probably some of you here who participate in surveillance programs, sit on steering committees for surveillance programs. So we're talking a little bit about that today. In addition, I've worked very closely on registries in the neuromuscular space, both at MDA and, as Harsha mentioned, at Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, or PPMD, and also with QRSMA. I really love how Scott, when he was framing it, talked about the need for a paradigm shift. And I think a number of us use this drug development pipeline when we talk about the drug development spectrum. And we spend a lot of time focused on how we get from discovery, the concepts that are needed to be developed and funded, the animal models, all the way through what I think we spend a lot of time thinking about as the holy grail, approvals. And the data that we collect and the patient experiences that we collect with an eye on that prize, that hurdle of the approval, and how we're going to help inform the decision-making around that. And we work with the stakeholders and the partners that we need to help inform that journey and that decision-making, and what are the endpoints and the outcomes that we need, what are, how do we inform the protocols for clinical trials? But in truth, and as we learned, I think a little too late in Duchenne, and so some of the hindsight that I'd like to share is that in truth, that pipeline, there's a lot more to it. And what I wish we had spent more time doing, and now we work with a lot of our rare disease partners in doing, is not just thinking about the holy grail or the hurdle as being approval, but thinking about also what those within the access environment need to understand about the patient journey and about patient experience, and pulling those values, those outcomes, those data elements into our data collection, into our registries as early as possible, so that we can be collecting that long-term to inform decision-making all along this pipeline. Because in truth, we have lots of different stakeholders that need to understand our patient communities, not just the clinical trialists, not just the clinicians, not just the regulators at the FDA, not just the payers. And as patient communities, we need to be able to collect that data in a way that's going to speak to everybody at different time points. And there are going to be lots of different companies that are going to be interested in that data. And there are going to be lots of different clinical trials with different kinds of inclusion criteria. And each of our patient communities has different subpopulations that will get sliced and diced. But we as patient communities need to be really thoughtful about how we collect that data and make sure that we are communicating with all those stakeholders and ensuring that we are collecting that data in a way that when it comes time to have an approval and a payer starts to look at the data that's collected, we have answers to the questions that they're going to be asking. So all of this sort of gets wrapped up in some terminology that we actually haven't used much today. And so I think a lot of people are probably familiar with these terms, but I think it's important to break them down a little bit. We talk a lot about patient-focused drug development, or PFDD, and these are terms that actually the patient community used for a very long time before they were defined, but they've actually now been defined in legislation and in statute, and they were defined through the last PDUFA cycles and in 21st Century Cures. And what was really amazing about 21st Century Cures is that when 21st Century Cures was signed into law, patient-focused drug development was codified as a part of FDA's mission for the very first time. And that was because of all of the energy that patient communities had put into taking this concept that had been integrated into PDUFA 5 and innovating within it and making this concept permanent and pushing that momentum forward so that when we got to the next PDUFA cycle and when 21st Century Cures was passed into law, it actually had to then be codified as a part of FDA's mission. And FDA had really wrapped their arms around this concept and integrated it into its decision-making. And the reason that's so important is that means that not only the patient groups that were investing in developing patient-focused drug development tools could continue to do so, but our industry partners that were trying to invest in it were getting the signal they needed to continue to invest in it. And so this momentum that we as communities and partners drive is so critically important. So PFDD is defined as the systematic approach to helping ensure that patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into the development and evaluation of medical products throughout the medical product lifecycle. And then the other term that's used is patient experience data. And that is data that can be collected by any persons. And that's really important because that means it's not data that's just collected by industry or by academics. It can be data collected by patient advocacy communities and patient advocacy groups, and is intended to provide information about patients' experiences with a disease or condition. I provide the list that's broken down even further. And again, this comes from statute and the source is there. And it's data that is intended to inform the impact of disease and treatment of symptoms, patient and caregiver perspectives about potential and curative treatments. And again, it's really important to notice that caregiver perspectives are recognized, views on unmet medical needs and available medical interventions. So that means that just because there might be an approved product on the market does not mean we can assume that that community is checked off one and done. That means that there is a recognition that there are unmet medical needs in communities even once the products are approved, and enhanced understanding of the natural history of the disease or condition. And so here's just a list of examples of those tools. And again, we're spending today really focused on registry data, natural history data, but there are a lot of different kinds of patient-generated data that fall into this category. And many of us here today are collecting and generating this data and working with partners to do so. So benefit risk and patient preference studies fall into this bucket. Any guidances that we may be developing, patient-reported outcomes, the registry and natural history data sets, surveillance data, as I mentioned before, core outcome assessments, testimony from patient communities and clinical experts. So for groups that have had either FDA-led or externally led patient-focused drug development meetings or listening sessions at the FDA, they fall into this category and are considered health economic impact data or economic burden data, sometimes it's referred to, which can include caregiver impact, absenteeism or presenteeism, non-direct and indirect cost data. And some of that data is especially important when you're talking about the access environment, electronic health record data, and ICD codes. And ICD codes are incredibly important for helping track a lot of this data and integrating it, especially within the EHR. The one thing I want to flag is, for those who aren't aware, when we had 21st Century Cures, so there were a number of patient advocacy groups that led an effort called a legislative effort called the Patient Focused Impact Assessment Act. I was one of the groups that helped lead this, and it was signed into law. And what it did was ensure that patient experience data would be formally incorporated into the regulatory review at FDA. So it meant that it was no longer just a nice to have, but it was a need to have, so that when reviewers actually looked at a submission, so a drug company submits a product for review, that any patient experience data that was available to enhance the understanding of how that product might mitigate a patient's experience of their disease was incorporated into that review. And the reviewers had to indicate what data was used in that review. And there was a formalized checklist that was developed. And then that law was passed and then became a section of 21st Century Cures. It's actually section 3001, 3002, 21st Century Cures. And this is what the patient experience data checklist looks like. This is a sample of it being completed. And FDA has actually expanded on how this is used themselves, and there's a lot of work in the space talking about how it can be expanded upon further. But I flag it to say that patient experience data is here to stay and is being expanded on. So as patient communities, this is a really important signal to us that the efforts that we're putting in is not just spinning our wheels. It's incredibly important for us to ensure that we're working with our industry partners, we're working with academic partners, we're working with regulators to ensure that the patient experience, the lived journey of our caregivers and our communities are being fully integrated into clinical trial design, into natural history studies, into regulatory decision-making, and into the access environment. So there are a lot of resources. I know everyone has shared some resources, and hopefully these slides will all be available. And there are a lot of wonderful rare disease groups that are working to empower communities that are looking to start registries, are putting tools and guidebooks together. So I've compiled some of them here. RareX has a wonderful initiative underway. Global Genes has a guidebook that they've put together, as well as a webinar series. PCORNet has a network that they've put together for rare disease partners. There's a Rare Disease Cures Accelerator data initiative being led by Critical Path, funded by FDA, and an initiative through NORD. Eric actually manages this and already talked about it, but it's the NCATS toolkit. It's not just focused on registries. This is a great place for, if you don't know this toolkit, I recommend everyone go there and look at what's available. This is a really important set of resources for rare disease groups and partners. And then there's an initiative being led by the National Health Council. EveryLife Foundation, IVI, provided some seed funding, but they're looking for other partners to join this effort. But it's to look at essentially the data that came from the patient-focused drug development workshops at FDA and look at how we can transform those narratives and that data into outcomes and impacts, broader impacts, pull that into a shareable database and data set that will be made publicly available. And that's a year-long project, but then would be publicly available.